Hello, this is Kyle Green with the Greenway Outdoors, and we are at Huron Valley Guns in New Hudson, Michigan. I wanted to make this video because when I was a kid and I would buy a gun and I would buy a cartridge, I would just match the 308 with the 308 or the 270 with the 270. What I didn't know, and a lot of people don't realize, is there's a lot of different bullets, even from the same manufacturer. Today we're going to be working with a 28 Nosler cartridge, but a bunch of different bullets. We're going to be using AccuBonds, we're going to be using Ballistic Tips, and those different bullets do different things to different game. And depending on how far the game is going to be from you, depending on what type of game you're hunting, you may need a different bullet. So we're going to be shooting gel blocks and looking at the data to determine what bullet is right for your hunt. You're going to learn a lot. Let's get started. For our test samples today, we're going to be using a 110 Ultralight by Savage. It's got a carbon barrel. Savage's barrels, especially the carbon ones, are known for their accuracy, so I wanted to use the best control group I could find, and we're going to be using a Trijicon scope. Now let's dive into the ammunition itself. The first one we have is the 28 Nosler 160 grain AccuBond trophy grade. If you were to go to a store, you're probably going to encounter this. This is the premium product. It's like the most standard one you could get. They're supposed to be really good mushrooming on impact at different distances. This is gonna kind of be like our control group, and we'll start with this one. 3, 2, 1. AccuBond features a heavily tapered jacket and a single lead core that's actually bonded to the jacket. Now what this gives you is consistent mushrooming across all ranges and all types of animals. So I used it as my base study here. And again, we're using the 28 Nosler. We're seeing a lot of damage come through right out of the gate. You're seeing these different waves of damage as they come through, and right here, you'll notice just a couple fragments coming off of it. Now this shot was at between 35 and 50 yards. Those little fragments aren't gonna hurt anything. It's very common, and to be honest with you, a bullet only fragmenting this little at such a close range is actually a good sign that it's still good, because you see a lot of weight retention as that bullet comes through. And obviously complete devastation and mayhem in the actual target itself. And this is what we're looking for. You know, people forget when a bullet goes through and creates a wound cavity, you want that cavity to be as big as possible. You want as much kinetic energy to be pumped into that animal as possible. You want the actual damage to be a big open area. That way the animal dies quickly and effectively. And obviously this AccuBond, watching this through, does exactly that. But it's incredible to see what it did to the gel block. This is a great test group because it's the first bullet. If you're going to look for one bullet, I would recommend the AccuBond trophy grade. If you don't want to have to think about it, you don't want to get in technicalities, and you want to know that even if it's a big animal or a small animal or a far animal or a close animal, you're good, this one's for you. Next up is the 160 grain Nosler Partition. Now, if you've followed Nosler over the years, then you know the Partition is kind of the gold standard for what they've used for big game for many, many years. It's tried and true and still works, but I want to see the difference when we run it through the gel. 3, 2, 1. Okay, now let's talk about the original flagship of Nosler ammunition, and that is the Partition. Now the Partition is, think of it like a two-piece bullet where there's a front lead core and a back lead core, and they're separated by a partition. And the way the bullet works is it punches through, and the front lead core will mushroom nicely, while the back one will typically retain its retention. It's great for cracking through bones. Let's see how it looks on the graph here. Right out of the gate, I am seeing that the ammunition is tearing through more directly. It seems like it's holding its speed a little bit faster than, say, the AccuBond, and it looks like the cavity that it's making isn't quite as big, and I think that's because you've got the front lead core that's doing the mushrooming, but not as much, right? It's got a little bit more of the weight retention and the bullet staying behind it so it can punch through more directly. I'm seeing absolutely no fragmentation whatsoever. I'm seeing it just tear through. Now, what does this tell me? This tells me that this bullet would be really good for animals with tough hides. You want to be able to poke through, and you want some mushrooming, but you want that weight retention, say, to get through the thick hide, or a bone. And that's why if you're looking at going to Africa and doing some really big game, you're often going to see that the ammunition that they recommend is still the tried and true Nosler Partition, and I can see why. Still devastation, still going to create a great wound channel, but it's going to punch through the bone when you need it for that big game. So for this ammo, I recommend big game, tough hides, punching through bone. Okay, the next one is in some areas, or just if you're that type of hunter, you might need a lead-free option. So Nosler has what's called their ETip. And this one's 150 grain, so it's a little bit lighter bullet. And I want to see how this one looks going through the gel block, because in some situations, this may be the ammo you have to use. 3, 2, 1. Like it owed me money. Number 3 is the ETip. Now, before you get all worried, Nosler still makes lead ammunition, but in some areas you have to go lead-free, and some people just choose to want to go lead-free. So that's why we have the ETip, but I'm going to teach you a few things about it. First and foremost, you're going to notice I'm shooting a 28 Nosler. This bullet is 150 grain as opposed to 160 grain. Now, why is that? Copper is just not as heavy as lead. So in order to get to 160 grains, the bullet would end up getting too long. Therefore, they stick with the 150 grain for this. Now, here's a fun fact about copper, is it has no loss of weight retention when it goes through a target. So think about that. With that weight retention, it means that the bullet doesn't fragment and you don't lose pieces of it. Typically, 60%, 70% is like a good number for weight retention with bullets. With the ETip and the copper, you have 100% weight retention. Now, this is important because a lot of times when you're at super close range on game, you can have that fragmentation happen. So if you shoot the ETip, you can shoot an animal at 30 yards or you can shoot an animal at 300 yards and you're not going to have that fragmentation regardless. A point a lot of people might not realize is without that fragmentation, you can kind of punch above your weight a little bit. So for an example, if you were to use a lighter deer load, say for a kid, we'll go with the 243 for example. It's a little bit light for whitetail. So if you were to shoot an ETip, you could kind of punch above your weight a little bit because you know you're going to have that full weight retention. So it makes those lower, smaller calibers a little bit more effective. But let's see what it does to ballistic gel. Okay, what's interesting about this one that is very different than the others is I am witnessing the spin and I'm seeing like these sections of bubbles, and what it kind of looks to me is almost like a prop on a motor cutting through water and just creating havoc. It came out the other side. I see no fragments. It had complete weight retention. But what's interesting about it is I am seeing really solid mushrooming out of this. One of the biggest complaints people have with copper bullets and lead-free bullets in general, there was a lot of people saying that they were seeing them not mushroom. They were just poking a hole right through. People kind of stayed away from the E-tips because of that. But now you're seeing perfect mushrooming. You're seeing absolute havoc right through there. You can use it at any type of distance. The perfect application for this bullet is when you have to shoot lead-free, and then pretty much any big game if you think you might be close range versus far range. And the absolute best case scenario is if you have a kid that's shooting a little bit of a light caliber for the game they're hunting, this will help them punch above that weight. Okay, next one up is the Nosler trophy grade ammunition. This one's 175 grain, so this one's good for longer distances. Now what that should mean is it takes less energy to get the bullet to mushroom because it's anticipating impacting animals, say 300 or 400 yards downrange. 3, 2, 1. Now the AccuBond long range is just like the AccuBond in how it's made, except for it's gonna have a far softer tip. Now the goal of that soft tip is when you think about it, if you're shooting an animal at long range and you impact the animal at 400 yards as opposed to like a typical 100 or 200 yard shot, the bullet isn't gonna have the same amount of energy by the time it gets there. So the long range features a softer tip that will expand with less energy forcing it to. The bullet's gonna have a little bit better ballistic coefficient, and it's not gonna be impacted as much by the wind. Our test was done, like I said, between 35 and 50 yards. meaning that the AccuBond long range is not in its best situation. You wouldn't take a drag car to a course that was all windy and moving. But at the same time, I wanted to see how it looked as far as weight retention on a close-up shot, so let's get a look at it. Okay, right out of the gate, as soon as it hit the target, it seemed to open up more than the other ones we've done so far have. And what I'm seeing is I'm seeing pieces and fragments of the actual bullet here. And as it comes out the other side, I'm seeing other fragments tail out behind it. So no big surprise there. The bullet, like I said, is softer. It's made for long range. The one thing I will say though, is if you think you're gonna take a long range shot and that's why you choose the trophy grade long range, I think you'll find that this is still a very dead deer at 35 to 50 yards as well. So if you know you're probably gonna have a long range shot, then having a bullet that you know is gonna have that soft tip and you know is gonna mushroom nicely for you is really gonna help you out. Our next bullet is the one I'm most excited to shoot the gel block with, and that is our Ballistic Tip from Nosler. This is 160 grain. Now, Ballistic Tips are made specifically to open quickly and big upon impact. So let's run it through the gel and see what that one looks like. 3, 2, 1. Now, I would say out of all these options, this is the one people typically know the least about. The Ballistic Tip is made to expand quickly as soon as it gets in the animal. A lot of times with a Ballistic Tip, you actually will not have an exit wound. Now let's take a look at this one. Right upon impact, I see absolute devastation, tons of energy going through. And as it comes out the back side, I see that the bullet did open up quite a bit. It's almost got this tail at the end of it. The bullet held a lot of the weight retention, a lot of the energy, all got transferred in through here, and it obviously mushroomed quite a bit. Now, what is the Ballistic Tip good for? The Ballistic Tip for me is awesome in a situation where I have an animal that I do not want to go anywhere. You see these people shooting big sheep on the edge of mountains and stuff like that. I don't want that animal to go to 50 yards and jump off a cliff. I don't want that animal to do anything. I'm not worried about blood trailing it. I want to knock him down where he stands. That's where the Ballistic Tip shines. While there won't always be an exit wound, you are gonna give 100% of that energy to the animal, and it's probably gonna knock him down and stop him in his tracks right where he is. I especially like this bullet on an animal that has a little bit thinner skin, pronghorn antelope, whitetail, that sort of thing. I hope this video gave you the information you need. If you're in a situation where you're trying to pick the right bullet for your game, there's a lot of variables to take into account. If you're gonna pick one, I'd always go with the AccuBond trophy grade. But we have a lot of other options at Nosler, and that's gonna give you a lot of great opportunities to be very specific and very pointed with your goals in the field. Thanks so much for tuning in. Stay green.